I want to talk about this house. Well, not this specific house. There are literally thousands of these houses across the city of Vancouver. This one house, it's called the Vancouver Special, and once you notice one of them, you can't stop seeing them. There's one, there's another one, there's a group of them, a red one, a green one, a blue one. So how does a city end up with so many copies of one specific house? Well, I think the answer might offer some lessons for Canada's housing crisis. Our story begins in the 1960s. The city of Vancouver was experiencing a boom in immigration and housing in the city was running out. People needed homes and fast. Enter Larry Cudney, a local draftsman and a guy who apparently hated taking photos because I can't find one of him literally anywhere. He created a design for a house that would eventually become known as the Vancouver Special. It was simple and cheap to build. Its key feature, a low-pitched roof, meant you used fewer materials compared to a steeper roof. But the Vancouver Special wasn't just cheap, it also exploited a loophole, and that was because of its first floor. At the time, if you wanted to construct a house, there were rules that limited the size of your building by limiting how much square footage you could build. But the loophole? Back then, your basement was not included in that square footage calculation, and the definition of basement was a bit ambiguous. The first floor of the Vancouver Special was 18 inches below the ground, and for the city's lawmakers, that was enough to call it a basement. So the entire first floor of this house was technically off the books. This was a huge advantage. You could, of course, build a much bigger house, but also this so-called basement often ended up being used as a whole new unit of housing. You could have two separate families living under one roof. Now at the time, this was technically illegal. The city's rules stipulated that a house could only have one family, no more. But with this basement, the Vancouver Special helped people circumvent these rules. On paper, this was a one-unit house, even though it was often a two-unit house in practice. A one-unit house on the streets and a two-unit house in the sheets. Okay. This made the Vancouver Special perfect for many aspiring homeowners. For immigrants with relatives, they could house their extended family on the first floor. For working-class residents, they could rent out that floor and use that income to pay their mortgage. For these groups, the Vancouver Special became very popular. And that leads to the final reason for why we built so many of these houses: economies of scale. As more and more Vancouver Specials were built, it became just way easier to build them. The materials became standard in the construction industry, and city staff began to recognize the design and improve it for construction more quickly. In fact, it's been reported that you could get the plans for a Vancouver Special from Larry for $65 and have it approved and built in about 3 weeks. In the middle of a housing shortage, the Vancouver Special provided affordable housing for the people who really needed it. It provided the most house for your buck, with an extra unit of housing, and it was really, really easy to build. And boy did we build them. Around 10,000 Vancouver Specials were constructed between 1965 to 1985. And while the Vancouver Special is an exceptional example, it certainly isn't alone. Most places have a specific house design that can be found all over the city. These repetitive designs exist for a simple reason. The easiest way to build a lot of housing really fast is to build the same house over and over and over again. To me, this story feels relevant right now. Many cities today find themselves with a shortage of housing, and part of the reason why is because building new housing is very difficult. Like the past, there are rules that limit how much you can build on a piece of property, often called zoning bylaws. And in many cities, most neighborhoods only allow for houses to be built in them. These are known as single-family neighborhoods, and they usually make up the majority of land in North American cities. Now, you can actually apply to build something larger than a house in a single-family neighborhood through a process called rezoning. But that's where things get a lot more complicated. Rezoning typically requires multiple applications, reports, consulting firm, council meetings, public hearings, and expertise of planning law, tons of money, and oh yeah, about 2 years. But even with all that effort, there is still no guarantee that you will even be successful. Your application could be denied. Rezoning is a slow, complicated, and risky process. Now, these rules and processes exist for a simple reason. Very few people in single-family neighborhoods want a high-rise or something more disruptive built next to their home. But the problem is that these rules end up stifling any changes to these areas. For example, the application process for this co-housing development in East Vancouver took 2 years, not the construction, the application process. When building new housing is this difficult, the usual result is that no new housing gets built at all. So that gets me thinking, what if we had a new Vancouver Special? A building that's cheap to build, houses more people, and is quickly approved for construction in all these single-family neighborhoods. Well, there's actually something like that happening already. In 2018, the city of Kelowna held a competition for designs that could fit multiple units of housing on properties within single-family neighborhoods. The winning designs for a quadplex were given a fast-tracked approval process. Normally, this kind of building would take over a year to approve in these neighborhoods, but with these designs, you could start building in 2 to 3 weeks. In the past 2 years, over 200 of these quadplexes have been built, creating over 800 new units of housing. I think Kelowna's story is pretty incredible, and one that will likely result in a Kelowna Special of sorts. But there is another side to this story that complicates things. At the height of its popularity, the Vancouver Special was perhaps the most hated piece of architecture in the city. Many complained that they were bland, ugly, devoid of architecture, and way too big. But more than anything, many felt that there were simply too many of them. And at the end of the day, the critics got their way. In the 1980s, the city officially made it illegal to build any more Vancouver Specials. Right now, the Kelowna Special is meeting the same fate. As of 2021, these quadplex designs are no longer being approved for construction, a decision that came after concerns that too many of them were being built. This sort of strikes at a tension that I think exists at the heart of the housing crisis. On one hand, most of us do want more housing, but on the other hand, we tend to want it done in a way that doesn't change our communities too drastically. We want new housing to be affordable, but not look too tacky or repetitive. So it's really no surprise to me that the Vancouver Special and other designs like it have been controversial. But there is an interesting twist to this story. In the years following the cancellation of Vancouver Specials, a wave of public sympathy grew around these houses. They were recognized for their role in allowing immigrants and working-class people to build their own housing, despite the criticisms of architecture snobs and social elites. Today, this house is viewed as a valuable part of the city's history. In fact, it has a bit of a cult following. You can find it on t-shirts, posters, cross-stitch art, craft beers, or even consume it in gingerbread form. I think there's an important lesson here. Maybe we don't need to be so concerned about the look of new housing because, frankly, looks are just a small part of why we value things. The Vancouver Special didn't care about being the most beautiful house, it just cared about being the most useful and affordable house for the people building them. And instead of the world ending, we grew to love these houses, for reasons I'm not sure we'll fully understand. But what I do know for sure is that right now, many cities do need more housing, and they need it fast. So I can't help but wonder, maybe it's time for a new special.